We have always heard African patriots and Pan-Africans comment on how the West has contributed largely to the current state of Africa's development. But it hits differently when those who have benefited from Africa's underdeveloped state confirm the contribution of the West to Africa's current status. Recently, a French professor revealed certain truths in Western media about the real reason why Africa is the way it is. He said, "No one is interested in Africa developing too much." This is a very strong statement to say on Western media. But that's not all he said. The professor went on to reveal the reason why this is so. In this video, we are going to analyze what he revealed in detail. The French professor started by saying, "No one is interested in Africa developing too much, because if it develops tomorrow, there will be a problem." He went on to say, "Let's imagine Africa develop its industry like South Korea did, a country that was as poor as Mozambique. If tomorrow Africa starts making cars, refining its oil, and improving its agricultural production, Africa will no longer buy our imports." Did you hear that? But that's not all. According to the French professor, if you truly want to develop a country, that country needs to be industrialized. In simple terms, it's not just enough to have entrepreneurs, the country needs to have heavy industries. Now, the professor explained that Africa is blessed with minerals and raw materials, which is fantastic. But the problem in Africa is that Africa majorly exports these minerals and raw materials at a cheap cost to Western countries where they are processed into finished goods. And then, the West sells the finished goods back to African countries. However, the process of processing the minerals and raw materials, which is manufacturing, is what actually creates jobs and industries. The professor went on to use Congo-Brazzaville as an example. The Republic of Congo, also called Congo-Brazzaville, is among the African countries blessed with substantial reserves of crude oil and natural gas. Congo exports 90% of its oil to the West. But guess what? The majority of its oil fields are operated and dominated by Western private oil companies, especially Total Energies and the Italian oil company, Eni. What this simply means is that the country's own oil company does not have the capacity for drilling and exploitation. In simple terms, the Congolese oil company does not possess the knowledge and technical knowledge of oil production and processing. All of these are determined by the Western oil company, thereby creating a dependency. Of course, Congo has a percentage it is entitled to from the oil fields, but the fact is that it is nothing compared to what it would have gotten if the country processed its oil by itself. Now, these private companies such as Total Energy drill the oil, export it out of the country, and process it into finished products in their countries. Afterward, the Congolese government would have to buy finished products like gasoline and fuel from these companies. The amount of money used in buying back these finished products is usually more than whatever percentage the government is entitled to from the oil fields exploited by the private companies. Before we continue, here is a reminder to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to our channel so that you can get more videos like this. This scenario is typical in almost every African country. Take Niger, for instance. Niger is blessed with uranium, a critical mineral in the production of nuclear energy and weapons. Any country that has uranium deposits ought to be developed, but Niger is regarded as one of the poorest countries in the world. The reason is that its uranium fields have been left in the hands of French private companies, particularly Orano. For years, Orano has explored Niger's uranium mines, and just like how it is in Congo, Orano drills the mines and exports the uranium to France for processing. Think about it. Why don't these companies set up processing facilities in African countries? If there were industries that could process the minerals and raw materials in Africa, Africa would have been developed by now. These industries would not just create jobs, but also transfer the technical know-how to African workers. This will then reduce dependency on Western private companies, and Africa will no longer need to import finished goods from the West. Now, you are probably thinking, why don't African countries set up these industries themselves? Well, right from the beginning, African countries have been at a disadvantage. You see, to set up these heavy industries for manufacturing, Africa needs huge funding. However, African countries do not have this funding and will need to borrow from global financial institutions. But these institutions, like the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, were all created to favor wealthy Western countries at the expense of developing countries. You see, These organizations were created by the West and are controlled by the West. So borrowing from those institutions comes with certain conditions that need to be met. Now, when the West colonized Africa, they set up systems that African governments continued to follow even after independence. One such system was the exploitation of natural resources by Western private companies. In the 1960s, when most African countries got independence, the newly appointed governments had no choice than to follow these systems because it was the only way to survive. They had no findings, and the only infrastructures available were those set up by their former colonial masters. Now, those African countries that needed funds to run their countries had to borrow from the institutions created by the West. And, as we said, these loans came with conditions. One such condition was the adoption of the structural adjustment program proposed by the IMF and World Bank. This program advocated liberalization, privatization, and cutting down government expenditure. Many African governments had no choice but to implement the SAP in exchange for loans and with the belief that it would improve their economies. But it turned out to be the worst decision because it was the beginning of Africa's dependency on the West. With the SAP, more Western private companies were set up in Africa to exploit African resources. These companies were supposed to provide jobs and bring in foreign direct investment, which would ultimately lead to development. While they did provide jobs, these companies ended up ripping these countries and profiting massively from the exploitation of their resources. The agreement signed between these companies and African countries allowed them to access Africa's raw materials cheaply and easily, which they used to develop their countries. So, from independence till now, African countries have continued to depend on the West for critical needs. Think about it. Does it not seem that everything was designed from the beginning? So, as the French professor said, the West does not want Africa to develop because Africa will no longer buy our imports. Africa has the capacity to be self-sufficient, but the West doesn't want it to be self-sufficient. It's as simple as that. Now, some people would say, what about the corruption of African leaders? The French professor revealed something shocking. He said, "We have often said that poor countries are not developing because of corruption and because they are lazy. But that is just the reason the West has given." According to the French professor, if he were given the leadership of Congo-Brazzaville in its current state, it would be extremely difficult to develop Congo because of the system that has been set in place by the West. The French professor went on to say that the reason why it would be difficult is because Congo and Africa in general do not have control over their development because it does not have access to financing. Think about it. African leaders are corrupt, no doubt, but are African leaders the only corrupt leaders in the world? Is there no corruption in the West? Of course there is. African leaders are corrupt, but they are also battling with a century-long system designed by the West to keep Africa forever dependent on them. Now, some Western citizens would say, how about all the financial aid that the West is pouring into Africa? Well, that's just what Western governments want you to believe. The traditional thinking is that the African continent is so poor and cannot take care of it, and so it's up to the good people of the West to help the continent. So, they try to help by pouring billions of dollars into Africa through foreign aid and other private sector flows, and according to them, they do not receive anything in return from the continent. But that kind of thinking is false. It's actually the reverse. The African continent has been a net creditor to the rest of the world for decades while its people suffer under the so-called aid given by the good West. It's reported that in 2014, Africa received a sum of $133.7 billion in aid, but do you know how much left the continent that same year? A whopping $191.9 billion in the form of debt repayments, multinational company profits, and illicit financial flows. That's what, a net loss of $85 billion. Imagine that. Now, you would say, perhaps the net loss is a result of the billions of funds stolen by corrupt African leaders and hidden in offshore accounts, right? Well, that idea has been challenged by a recent report. According to estimates by Global Financial Integrity, corrupt activities such as bribery and embezzlement of public funds constitute only about 3% of illicit outflows. Criminal activities such as drug trafficking and smuggling make up 30% to 35%. But guess what takes the major part? Foreign multinational companies. These guys take a whopping 60% to 65% of illicit outflows according to the report. So can you see that money stolen by corrupt governments is insignificant compared to the money looted by Western companies? From the report, it has been reported that the most common way illicit money is moved across borders is through international trade. According to the report, over a 39-year period from 1970 to 2008, Africa has lost an estimated $854 billion. This means an average of $22 billion per annum, an amount that could have easily made a huge difference in the lives of the continent's poorer communities. In fact, and despite all the pious statements about social responsibility made by multinationals, the panel says the trend is getting worse. Between 2000 and 2008, the average illicit flows amounted to $50 billion per year, which is also the estimate for the current year. Fast forward to 2010, it was revealed that Africa was cheated out of $11 billion through just one of the tricks used by multinational companies to reduce tax bills. This amount is equivalent to 6 times the amount needed to plug the healthcare funding gap in Ebola-affected countries of Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau. Shocking, right? The report also says that just 1/3 of the loss associated with illicit financial flows would have been enough to fully cover the continent's external debt, which reached $279 billion in 2008, and that for every $1 received in aid, $10 is lost in illicit transfers. Winnie Byanyima, the executive director of Oxfam International, confirms this looting of Africa's fund by foreign corporations when she said that Africa is hemorrhaging billions of dollars because multinational companies are cheating African governments out of vital revenues by not paying their fair share in taxes. If this tax revenue were invested in education and healthcare, societies and economies would further flourish across the continent. In 2010 alone, these multinational companies avoided paying taxes on $40 billion of income through a practice called trade mispricing. It's a situation where a company artificially sets the prices for goods or services sold between its subsidiaries to avoid taxation. But trade mispricing is just one of the ways multinational companies avoid paying their fair share of taxes. According to UNECTAD, developing countries as a whole lose an estimated $100 billion a year through another set of tax avoidance schemes involving tax havens. These companies also lobby hard for tax breaks as a reward for basing or retaining their business in African countries. Tax breaks, for example, provided to the 6 largest foreign mining companies in Sierra Leone add up to 59% of the total budget of the country, or 8 times the country's health budget. So, if you add in mixed illicit and illegal transfers involving theft, bribery, and other forms of corruption by government officials, drug trading, racketeering, counterfeiting, contraband, and terrorist financing to the amounts looted by these foreign MNCs, you can imagine how much is coming out of Africa yearly. Now, the reason why Africa is vulnerable to this exploitation by Western companies is due to its underdeveloped governance and economic structures. A UN conference on trade and development in 2020 reported that high volumes of intra-company trading, the secrecy cloaking foreign investment activities, and loopholes in treaties leave countries in Africa vulnerable to tax avoidance. In essence, the governments of Africa lack the human, financial, and technical resources to stem this outflow of wealth. The fact is that if the West truly wants to help Africa, the first thing they should do is set up industries and allow the industry to boom. Local industries have not been able to boom in Africa because they have to compete with better products from the West imported into the country. But the West is not going to do it. So, it is left to African leaders to turn things around. But how can they do this? Well, since Africa doesn't have the financing, it means Africa needs to depend on foreign companies to set up the industries. So, let's take, for instance, a company like Total Energy that exploits oil fields in African countries comes to a particular African country. Instead of hurriedly signing off agreements that will not benefit the country, the government should insist that as part of the agreement, the company will have to set up a processing facility in the country and employ local hands so that the knowledge can be transferred to them. This was the tactic used by countries such as Qatar and the Emirates. It's no wonder they were able to develop as fast as they did. This way, not only will industries be built in the country, But technical know-how will be in the country, and the country will not need to spend a huge sum of money to import the finished goods. It's as simple as that. While a lot of countries are still battling this system created by the West, some countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are doing something different. These countries kicked out French forces and went ahead to nationalize their resources. Burkina Faso, for instance, banned the export of gold and has turned inwards. The government has set up a refinery and a mining waste processing facility. Niger has taken the mines exploited by Orano and nationalized them. Mali is pursuing an aggressive negotiation strategy to ensure that the country benefits from the exploitation of its resources. This is the way to go. It might be difficult, but Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are on a path to self-sufficiency and independence. The West doesn't want Africa to develop, but Africa can do something about it. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel.